Hello everyone. Today I want to talk to you about how Western media say that Trump managed to figure out Europe completely in just half a year. In addition, the US Trade Representative has indirectly admitted that China can retaliate against the US, but Canada cannot follow suit. The trade conflict between the US and Canada has received little attention from the outside world, but in fact, it reveals the US's attitude toward China. Last week, US President Trump signed an executive order to raise the tariff rate on Canadian goods sold to the US from 25% to 35% starting Monday, causing an uproar in Canada. LeBlanc, the Canadian cabinet minister in charge of negotiations with the US, said in an interview with CBS that Canada is trying to get out from under the US tariff restrictions. He expects that Canadian Prime Minister Carney will have a conversation with Trump in the coming days. LeBlanc also said that Canada is clearly disappointed by Trump's decision to raise tariffs. On this program, U.S. Trade Representative Greer defended the U.S. actions against Canada. He, in turn, accused Canada of taking retaliatory countermeasures against the U.S. Greer said that for a long time, when the president proposed imposing a 25% tariff on Canada, this part of the tariff was actually related to the fentanyl issue and border issues, right? This is a different mechanism from the reciprocal tariffs that were proposed later. So, what was Canada's response? What I know is that Canada retaliated. Before Canada took action, the only country in the world that had retaliated against US tariffs was China. So, if the US takes action and then faces retaliation from Canada, the US needs to maintain the integrity and effectiveness of its own actions. Therefore, the US had no choice but to further raise tariffs on Canada. When Greer heard the host mention that Canada's current countermeasures were put in place by former Prime Minister Trudeau, Greer immediately interrupted to say that these measures are still in effect today. The countermeasures that Canada is currently implementing against the US were mainly established by former Prime Minister Trudeau before he resigned in March this year. These include imposing retaliatory tariffs on American imports worth tens of billions of dollars, encouraging Canadians to buy domestic products, and reducing travel and spending in the US. At the same time, Greer said he is not worried that raising tariffs during the negotiations might harm the broader North American Free Trade Agreement. He said that President Trump believes the current trade system has ultimately resulted in a massive shift of manufacturing from the US to overseas. Since this is the outcome, this free trade system cannot be allowed to continue. Therefore, he is not worried that imposing tariffs will complicate the US-Canada negotiations. He believes that President Trump is working hard to revise the trade terms with Canada. If there is a possibility of reaching an agreement, they will find it. If there is no possibility, they will maintain the current tariff levels. When Canadian Cabinet Minister LeBlanc was asked whether Canada would lift its retaliatory tariffs against the US, he did not give a clear answer, only mentioning Canada's 25% retaliatory tariffs on US steel and aluminum. He emphasized that Canada's steel industry is of strategic importance to the country's national security, just as the steel industry is significant to Trump and the US economy. But the current situation is that, as the largest export market for Canadian steel, the US now faces a 50% tariff, which in effect blocks Canada's exports to the US. However, Canada's national security interests require them to have a vibrant steel and aluminum industry. LeBlanc also mentioned that in discussions with U.S. Commerce Secretary Rodney, during his conversation with Secretary Ross, he proactively pointed out that Canada has stricter rules than any other country to address the so-called issue of Chinese dumping, and that Canada could cooperate with the U.S. on this matter. He said that Canada has final smelting and baking systems in place to ensure that products containing composite steel from other countries are not dumped into the Canadian market. Therefore, Canada is exploring and advancing cooperation plans with the US, while also ensuring that Canada continues to have industries that are vital to its economic future. Of course, this approach does not conflict with the national security goals that Trump emphasizes. Clearly, LeBlanc's tactic is aimed at securing a tariff exemption from the US by sacrificing China's interests. However, Canada's trade negotiation team left Washington last week without reaching any agreement. Obviously, his arguments failed to persuade Trump. After winning the April election, Canada's new Prime Minister Carney had promised to firmly oppose Trump's tariff policies. Last month, he also stated that his goal was to reach an agreement with the United States to remove U.S. tariffs on Canada. He called on Trump to sign and implement the United States-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement during his first term. However, as Trump's stance has grown increasingly tough, Carney's initial optimism about reaching a deal has faded. In mid-July, he hinted that Canada might not accept any agreement that included tariffs just to meet Trump's final deadline. Earlier, The Washington Post reported that some Canadian business groups, and even Carney's political opponents, said that no deal would be better than accepting a bad one. Canada should stand its ground, rather than accept the unfair terms from the US like the other G7 allies did. After watching the disputes between the US and Canada, there are a few points worth noting. First, US Representative Greer said that before Canada retaliated against the US, the only country in the world to have taken retaliatory action against US tariffs was China. So, if the US takes action and then faces retaliation from Canada, the US would have no choice but to further raise tariffs. The implication is, how dare Canada try to imitate China? Second, Greer is indirectly admitting that China can fight back against the US, but Canada is not allowed to follow suit. When the US and China clashed, China responded by cutting off the supply of rare earth magnets to the US, forcing the US to reach a mutual tariff reduction agreement with China. But Canada doesn't have the leverage that China does. Third, on the surface, Greer appears to be anti-China, but in reality, he's a pragmatist. The head of the US trade negotiation team with China is Treasury Secretary Bessent, while Trade Representative Greer is a key figure in the team. He has a background as a lawyer, and during Trump's previous term, he served as Chief of Staff to former Trade Representative Lighthizer. Greer was already involved in trade negotiations with China at that time and has experience negotiating with China. After Trump's re-election, he nominated Greer as U.S. Trade Representative. Greer takes a tough stance on China in trade. He believes confronting China with trade policy is a generational challenge for the U.S., emphasizes the need for strategic decoupling, and warns that underestimating China's threat will cost the U.S. more. The U.S. must resist China's unfair trade practices while preventing China from gaining dominance in military and tech. Rumors say Trump wanted to reach an agreement with China, so he prevented hardline trade advisor Navarro from participating in this round of U.S.-China negotiations. Navarro, on the other hand, had participated in U.S.-China trade negotiations during Trump's previous term. So in Trump's eyes, Lighthizer is a pragmatist who can reach agreements with China. That's why Lighthizer can absolutely take a softer tone when dealing with a China that is on equal footing with the US, but becomes extremely tough when facing weaker countries like Canada and India. Additionally, speaking of the US-Europe trade agreement, it has drawn a wave of criticism within Europe. No one really knows why European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wanted to form this kind of alliance of convenience. A report from the UK Sunday Times on August 3 revealed that the new trade agreement reached between von der Leyen and Trump had the flavor of surrender. Von der Leyen agreed to an unfair trade deal without any resistance. According to the Sunday Times, as early as when Trump first introduced reciprocal tariffs, the European Commission had already prepared a set of strong countermeasures in response. The report revealed that the reason behind von der Leyen's later change of stance was her concern that Trump might use the trade dispute as an excuse to cut U.S. military support for Ukraine, or otherwise undermine European security. In addition, the EU is particularly concerned about the upcoming U.S. military posture review. This assessment could lead to the withdrawal of some of the approximately 80,000 U.S. troops stationed across Europe. Meanwhile, Spain's El País summed up the consequences of the US-Europe agreement, arguing that Trump managed to figure Europe out completely in just half a year. El País stated that in just half a year, Trump has already exposed all of Europe's weaknesses. After 6 months, Trump, with his relentless and aggressive approach, has made it clear that despite European leaders constantly talking about strategic autonomy, the continent is still a long way from achieving that goal. Europe lacks sufficient strength to make its own voice heard in order to influence the Netanyahu government in Israel regarding the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. Even though Europe has invested a great deal of money in the war in Ukraine, Washington still keeps Europe off the negotiating table. When Israel's retaliation against Iran set off a chain of events that could push the world into the unknown, Europe's voice was barely audible. One could even say it was completely absent. Kreib, the founder of the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics, put it this way: Trump is not the root cause of Europe's decline. He simply took advantage of Europe's weakness in ways that no other American president ever had. Some agreements are, in fact, not really about trade, but about Europeans having to pay the United States for security protection. Greer bluntly summed it up: this is not a negotiation between two sovereign nations, but rather a negotiation between a sovereign power and a weak country, or a group of weak countries that rely on the United States for security guarantees. That's all there is to it. To put it simply, Trump managed to strip Europe bare in just half a year. The European Union has already become insignificant in the grand scheme of the world. Von der Leyen missed the chance to connect with China and stand up to Trump, squandering a winning hand. This shows just how important leadership is.